Hello and welcome to this session, which is called Spectrum Licensing Mechanisms to Accelerate Innovation and Adopt Emerging Radio Technologies. Well, I think there's wide support for moving beyond exclusive licensing, but the questions remain: what approach or combination of approaches should be taken? Which countries will they work in? Will they work in all countries? The things we ought to think about are unlicensed spectrum. Is this really just about the expansion of the unlicensed approach, or should we be thinking about things like sharing mobile licenses, which are traditionally exclusive licenses? That's an idea being put forward in Britain. Should we be thinking about tiers of licenses like CBRS in the US? And another important question, of course, is how do we recognize the needs of incumbents, particularly mobile operators and the satellite community? So this session provides some answers, and we're lucky to have a very wide range of perspectives, starting with the view from the unlicensed world from Alex Royblatt from the Wi-Fi Alliance. He's going to be talking about unlicensed spectrum, how it can soon get congested, particularly in public areas like transportation and apartment buildings. We've also got a satellite perspective from Jennifer Manner, and she's going to talk about the multi-dimensional spectrum regime, how we need to recognize the different levels, not just time and geography, but the upper atmosphere, where you'll find HAPS and other similar services, and the satellite from low to high Earth orbits. We've also got an interesting presentation from Renato Lombardi from Etsy and Huawei, who is going to talk about how licensing, particularly when we think about wireless backhaul in the millimeter waves, needs to incentivize reusability, and how block licensing is a better spur for innovation than link-by-link licensing. And of course, none of this works without the vendors producing the hardware for these innovative new services. And we'll be hearing from Elizabeth Migwala from Qualcomm. And I'm also very pleased to say that we'll have a mobile operator's perspective from Hiroyuki Atarashi from NTT Docomo, who will be talking about local 5G in Japan and the progress towards dynamic frequency sharing in Japan. So, having introduced the panel, if I could go to Alex first from the Wi-Fi Alliance.
Well, thank you, Martin, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's great to be with all of you, and particularly on the panel with so many good friends. Since I represent predominantly unlicensed technology, and this panel is focused on licensing mechanism, being invited to participate in this panel initially struck me as a bit ironic. But after thinking about it, I realized that license-exempt approach is simply a variation of licensing mechanisms, and it's important one of that. So with that, I'm delighted to share Wi-Fi perspective on spectrum licensing. And so let's just go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. So spectrum licensing, regulators versus operators, and I'll share with you my perspective. So in yesterday's discussion, I think in every session, someone observed at least once that spectrum is a limited resource and there is no free spectrum left. But it is worth repeating here because it's an important point for our discussion. Spectrum scarcity creates a dichotomy between regulators and operators. Regulators seek to extract maximum benefit, while wireless network operators seek to secure exclusive access to spectrum to ensure that their investment in the network is not compromised in the future. But what if there was a technology that could bridge these diverging objectives? A technology that does not require exclusive access and is so resilient as to operate on non-interference basis. I think you all know where I'm going with this. Yes, there is such a technology, and it's called Wi-Fi. Right now, most of you are on Wi-Fi participating in this conference. and the cost of this capability in equipment, network setup, or spectrum access is minimal. That is pretty amazing. Let's go to the next slide. So at this point, I think there is no one who doubts the critical role that Wi-Fi plays in connectivity around the world, in developed or developing countries. There are countries that may be leading in the rollout of 5G, or in satellites, or in HAPS, or in fiber. But one thing that they all have in common is that they all rely on Wi-Fi for connectivity. Now, while the demand for Wi-Fi connectivity continues to grow, the spectrum situation is becoming dire. Wi-Fi operates in the same spectrum that was made available back at WRC 2003, which was fine when we used it to send short text messages and emails. But now users expect individual 4 or even 8K video streams and other applications. Wi-Fi technology has evolved and actually exceeds IMT 2020 capabilities on many aspects, as shown on the picture to the side. But until recently, Wi-Fi spectrum needs have been neglected, and that's becoming a more important issue than ever. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight, given that we're all suffering from the COVID pandemic, obviously it's quite important for our industry as well. If this is a new normal, our reliance on Wi-Fi has become even greater. And I just listed some statistics from recent studies that I think will help you all appreciate where it is. I'm not going to go through each bullet here, but what I wanted to emphasize is the last bullet on this slide. The degradation in performance is manifesting itself due to the lack of spectrum availability. And with increasing use of Wi-Fi, this degradation will increase as well, if nothing is done. Next slide, please. So to get back to the theme of this panel on the license-exempt mechanisms, regulators in different countries are moving forward, addressing the urgent need for Wi-Fi spectrum, and they're focusing on 6 gigahertz band, and which is ideally suited for Wi-Fi. In doing so, they're converging on 3 regulatory models. Very low power RLAN devices, which operate on a very short range. So for example, wearables or something for short range applications. Low power indoor only RLAN devices. These are the devices that we use in our homes. And there are techniques that I included here to ensure that these devices remain indoors. And by operating indoors, the signal is attenuated to the levels that are perfectly acceptable for incumbent services in the band that operate obviously outside the home. And then for standard power RLAN devices or high power devices, these can operate on geolocation database or some kind of other coordinated approach. For example, light licensing, if an administration chooses to provide connectivity to a stadium, they could identify that location and coordinate the use of RLAN devices there. So these are the license-exempt mechanisms for implementation of RLANs. And next slide, and thank you, everyone. Pleasure to participate in this panel again. Thanks. Back to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Alex. Just while we get the next slides teed up, I wonder if you could say a few words on how important you think Wi-Fi type services, not in the traditional sort of mid-range bands, but perhaps in the millimeter wave bands, how important do you think they can be in dealing with this spectrum congestion that you're mentioning? Well,
the millimeter wave bands present a unique challenge which cannot be overcome because it's a law of physics, and that's propagation. It's difficult to deliver this ubiquitous connectivity that the users expect from Wi-Fi in the millimeter wave bands. It's not a problem that's unique to Wi-Fi. It's a problem that applies to all the services or all the technologies. Unlike other technologies, though, Wi-Fi does have products on the market, and these are addressing applications that can be addressed to overcome these challenges. But obviously, it's not something that will replace the need in the mid-band spectrum.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Alex. We can have time for more questions afterwards. So if you've been listening to Alex and thinking, oh, I need to ask a question about that, please present your questions to us and we'll discuss them all in detail at the end of the panel. We can move on now to Jennifer Manna from EchoStar.
Good morning. Just waiting for the slides.
Yeah, no problem.
So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank the ITU and the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited about this topic and have given a lot of thought. Maybe we can go to the next slide, please. So when I was thinking about innovative ways to license, I really wanted to look at where the world is going. And I focused on 5G, though this morning I said, I should have said and beyond. Because I don't think this is a 5G phenomenon that we're seeing. We used to have, and I say even in the 4G world, it was starting to come about to be less siloed, but a very siloed world where you had standards were developed for the mobile industry, for instance, at 3GPP. I'm very excited that satellite is coming out in release 17, as well as HAPS. You're starting to see non-terrestrial technologies being used, and there's a recognition that you're going to need complementary technologies to achieve the goals of 5G, which is service everywhere that's reliable, resilient, etc. And so for satellite, I think we play a very special role. And I know our keynote speaker was a satellite operator, so I'll ride a little bit on what he said. But we do have different types of satellites and different systems for mobile, for fixed, very high quality, ubiquitous, resilience, greater capacity at lower costs. And as I said, we're going to be in the standard. So my vision of the future, if we can go to the next slide, when we think about licensing, is really this view where satellite plays a role in everything, whether it's mobility, whether it's to the home, whether it's doing a backhaul for cell sites, whether it's precision agriculture, an area I find extremely interested. We joke about connected cows, but putting a Fitbit. And so when I was thinking about this problem, I was really thinking, how does satellite become a part of this? But because satellite is only a part, we still need to make sure everyone else gets resources too. And I think it's a balance. I don't think it's equilibrium, though. And I'll talk about that in the next slide, please. So really thinking through, when we create a licensing regime, whether it's for satellite, terrestrial, fiber, you can name it, but it's really sticking on the satellite wireless side, spectrum issues, what do we need to think about? So I think technologies, especially satellite, really need global harmonization to capture the economies of scale. And I would say maybe even more so for satellites, whether you look at a system like Hughes, which is a fixed satellite that covers a big region, let's say the Americas, or a system like OneWeb, the speaker who just spoke, that's global. So we already cover all these areas, so we really need global harmonization of spectrum. Otherwise, it just becomes uneconomical, especially on the satellite side. Remember, satellites are limited in what they can launch up. And I think the devices are getting better, but the standards are still early. But I think this is something everyone has, and I think if you talk to my friends at GSMA, they would share the same thing. Long-term guaranteed access to spectrum is very important to everyone, but especially for satellite. When you look at geostationary satellites, you're talking 15, 20 years. We have a long lifespan on our systems. The NGSOs are going to be constantly refreshing, but those systems are meant to be up there for years and years. So you really need that guarantee that you're going to have that access. You can't go up easily, unfortunately, even with today's space technology, which is getting so exciting, and add a new band. The next one I think is maybe the most important. I probably should have put first, which is technology neutrality. And that is that our regulators and our policymakers, when they think about spectrum, must be technology neutral. That doesn't mean equal. For instance, just because you're allocating 2 gigahertz to satellite, it doesn't mean you need to do 2 gigahertz to mobile or 2 gigahertz to license exempt. But there needs to be a recognition that all the different uses, whether it's fixed wireless, HAPS, need access to some spectrum, and you've really got to look at those needs and really consider the impact of decisions. So this makes, I think, is probably the hardest part for policymakers when they're making awards of spectrum and thinking about it. I like Martin's introduction about different paths, and I think you do need a mix of different solutions of both shared and exclusive spectrum. There's going to be portions, unfortunately, at least I'm not smart enough to figure this out, and hopefully one of the other panelists, where I think there's going to continue to be exclusive spectrum for some time. Now, it doesn't mean that other operators can't operate on a secondary basis or a non-interference basis. There's still going to be a primary user in some bands, but I do think in a lot of bands there'll be shared use. And when I talk about shared use, it could be geographic, it could be time, it could be other ways. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the way that I think we really need to look at spectrum when we're looking at the sharing regimes in the next slide. But before I go there, go back one more second. Thanks. Just streamline regulatory regimes. And this is really important because I do think it gets you more efficient use of spectrum. One of the things that I think makes the satellite industry a little crazy is when we're doing widely deployed networks, whether it's for eSIMs or stations in motions or VSATs, some countries still have us getting individual licenses. When we're deploying hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, millions of devices, because of that, the spectrum just can't be used that efficiently. So one of the ways to get more efficiency is to come up with more efficient licensing mechanisms. And blanket licensing is one that I just want to highlight. So next slide, please. So now we get to the more interesting part. So because we're talking about innovative uses. So where do we go from here? So I think the first thing we have to do is how to better incentivize the use of spectrum. And we've seen things like, CBRS was certainly one, paying people to move, C-band in the US is another. But I would also like to go back to the mobile satellite service with a complementary ground component or terrestrial ground component. That was done, started in the US, I'd say in the mid-2000s, with the concept that you want to get the most efficient use of spectrum and you want different uses. And so there we allowed the MSS operators to get terrestrial use of the spectrum. That allows greater reuse. And it also serves certain policy goals, which is you do want satellite up there, mobile satellite for emergency response. Maybe it's not always the best way to organize it, but I wanted to use that as an incentive, as one way to incentivize. The real point I wanted to get to today was this concept, and I'm still just putting this together, which is a multi-dimensional spectrum regime. And this regime has to go beyond time and geography in looking at spectrum and look at many different things. And the reason this really comes to pass is we're seeing such a change in the world. I'd say up until even 5 years ago, we really thought in terms of we had terrestrial, we had stuff flying through in airplanes maybe, and then we had satellites somewhere, up there. Well, now you're in such a different world. We've got many different types of terrestrial at all different heights. I mean, small cells have really changed even where we are on the ground, because you may not have to put a cell site on a tower. You may want to just put it on the fence along the road. You've also got HAPS and, things on drones. Let's say people are talking, and I think it's not unrealistic. It scares me. But talking about maybe having taxis flying overhead or delivery drones or whatever, and there's going to be use there. You've got all different levels of satellite communications. You've got space-based communications starting at 250 kilometers, your small Satellites are starting at 450. You've got the LEOs at 1200. You've got the GEOs. You've got MEOs in between there. You've got inter-satellite communications. One of the big items for the ITU this year is inter-satellite links, really between non-geo, besides satellite to satellite in the same orbit, but satellites between orbits. And then you're going to have space-based communications. And I don't know how many of you caught, but Nokia has announced that they're building a 4G network with NASA on the moon. So you're going to have communications on the moon. You're going to have communications in space at all different levels. You've got this whole wild world. And I really think when we look at this, we've got to change how we look at spectrum usage. It is no longer, maybe the term would have been three-dimensional, it is multidimensional. And that has to impact how we look at allocating, assigning, and sharing the spectrum. And I do make the point, I think the time has come where we're going to have to start looking at aggregate. We're going to have, if 5G is successful as it's going to be, we're going to have billions of devices on the ground radiating up. If the NGSOs are all successful, we're going to have, I forgot what the number was, I think by 2025, we're looking at 60,000 spacecraft in orbit coming down. So I don't think that's an issue that we can just say is theoretical anymore. Just two quick points and then I'll turn on. One of the things that I think is critically important is to avoid allocating spectrum for specific technologies. I'll give you an example. Agenda item 1.18 at the ITU has a proposal to allocate spectrum for narrowband, low power IoT MSS. I think that's a mistake. Regulators and policymakers and companies are often wrong about what's going to be used. And so I still think we should really focus on allocating spectrum to radio services, and that's where we're best served. And then the other thing, of course, we must do no matter what is we must make sure our regulatory frameworks are streamlined, because imposing too many burdens is going to slow the deployment of services and connectivity. And this is critical, as we've seen, especially during COVID, where we are trying to get service to everyone, including remote unserved areas. And anything that slows it down or makes it uneconomic by excessive regulatory fees and the like really is a disservice to the folks we're trying to serve. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much. And I'll turn the floor back over to Martin.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. I was very interested that you brought up this idea of a multi-dimensional approach to preventing interference and to spectrum management. How do you feel about the Loon approach to that, where you have these very complex computer programs looking at where all the devices in space are going to be, and therefore making sure that your transmissions don't interfere with that? Do you think something like that is the way forward?
So it's funny you say that, since I just filed in that proceeding.
Okay.
2 days ago on that very issue. I think it's an interesting area, but one of the things we did say, we need to study it more. It's very new. I think things like that may be appropriate, it may work, but it's still very early. Loon unfortunately didn't put terribly much information in the docket on that, so we weren't able to study it as well. But I am looking forward to engaging. But I think before we even get to that, Martin, and part of what I've been struggling with on this multidimensional approach is I think we have to figure out what we're looking at first and scope it out a little bit more. And I'm not saying that the Loon stuff should wait for that. I'm just talking more from a regulatory perspective. I really think we have to take a look at all the different pieces. And I really do go back to aggregate because that's something that we've never taken a look at. I can't think of any country that's really thought about that. And I do think that's going to change things. And I'm afraid what we're going to do is we're going to pass on some of these issues. And we're going to have problems that you can't fix. And that'll just be a disaster. So I think Loon is interesting, but I think that we still need to study it. But I thank you for the question.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we'll move on now to Renato Lombardi, who's representing ETSI, but comes from Huawei, and he's going to talk about wireless backhaul in millimeter wave.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Martin, for the introduction. Thank you for the organization for inviting me. So I'm here speaking on behalf of ISG MWT, where ISG stands for Industry Specification Group, MWT millimeter wave transmission, and our sort of industry alliance within the ETSI umbrella. We take care of all the fixed services, or let me say microwave, millimeter wave for backhaul. Next slide, please. So here are some facts, first of all, in terms of wireless backhaul. So as you probably know, we are using a lot of frequency bands from 6 to 42, what we call microwave traditional bands, and the E-band 71, 86. Microwave, even if probably not well known, is still the biggest technology choice for operators for the backhaul, with more than 70% of the macro base stations that are backhauled with microwave millimeter wave. Of course, with big regional differences, and also in the same country, we may have differences between among different operators according they are incumbent or not, and also with the GSMA that you see on the bottom left part of the slides that foresees in 2025 still terrestrial wireless backhaul to be one of the most important way for backhauling 5G and 5.5G is what is going to come, and so it's absolutely important for IMT success to ensure the spectrum with proper regulations and licensing for the backhaul. Please, next slide. So first of all is we at this group in ETSI, we divided the macro base stations according to different categories where they are placed from geographical and network point of view. So from rural, suburban, urban, dense urban, with different requirements in terms of transmission distance and capacity to be backhauled according, of course, to the maturity of the deployment of 5G. So how much spectrum is given for access and the overall coverage of the territory. We see that, of course, fiber is penetrating the network, and there's more and more fiber, and is also moving from the city down to the rural areas, where normally the base stations, so the macro sites are less profitable. So they will most probably remain on microwave millimeter wave technology. Microwave is affected by rain attenuation, so we have the use of different bands according to the regions. So the tropical areas with high rain intensity normally use the lower frequencies, 6 to 23, while we see the really take off with increase 50% year over year in the last 3 years of the E-band, and also the aggregation of E-band with traditional microwave to cover the urban and the suburban area. Please, next slide. What is also happening is not only in order to meet the requirements of 5G, is not only happening the increase of capacity. We see also, thanks to the penetration of fiber into the network, more points of presence of fiber, and therefore topologies that is moving from long chains or trees of microwave links to the tail site in star topologies or hubs and spikes. So somehow reducing the distance, also thanks due to the densification of the network, the distance we have to cover from the point of presence of fiber to the macro base stations. Here you can see in the graph an average distribution of the off lamps, and you see that up to 30 to 50% according to the rain region of the links can be covered with E-band, and a higher percentage with the aggregation of E-band with dual band. And of course, the further densification with microcells when 5G millimeter wave is going to be deployed will further push the use of millimeter wave or even frequencies above the 90 gigahertz. Next slide. We are working somehow to modernize the overall wireless backhaul for 5G. Of course, continuously introducing new technologies, very often also inspired by the radio access part by using innovative antennas, interference mitigation cancellation techniques, band aggregation. We just started a work item on defining new KPIs for microwave. Most of the links are installed with individual licensing or with KPI that are individually set per each link. So if we want to better exploit the use of spectrum from a more geographical perspective, we are considering how to change the KPI from link to individual link to mixed area, introduce end-to-end service-based KPI, and no longer always based on the availability of the link itself. We have still to do a lot of work in order to facilitate the use of the E-band 71 to 86, because in many countries it's not released yet, and we have also to convince administrations to lower the licensing costs in order to make affordable the backhaul of 5G. The next step would be to go beyond 90 gigahertz, especially with W-band and D-band, and also check what is possible to do in terms of applications for the frequencies above 175 gigahertz. Overall, we'll have to move in order to exploit the new technologies, move from individual, so link by link licensing, to block licensing, exactly inspired or let me say taken on the success that was coming with this kind of licensing for IMT, for the overall mobile operations. And that's the only way for us to introduce these new technologies and aiming at using wider channels and the using of the frequency. Next slide. So what we're going to do is to convince administrations to introduce, to incentivize geographical spectrum efficiency, so to incentivize technologies that can permit a much higher usability of the channels, either because we go to higher frequencies that are intrinsically more usable, or because of the introduction of interference cancellation, higher directivity antennas, and possibly to move to block licensing, where the operator is somehow responsible for the planning of the network without the need of central coordination, and which it is possible to exploit at most all these new technologies. Next slide. And so this is let me call like our spectrum agenda for the wireless backhaul. So for traditional microwave bands that are necessary for the longer links or links above a few kilometers in the tropical area, they need to have wider channels, because we are reaching the cap of what can be the spectrum efficiency on the link itself. So we need to introduce geographical spectrum efficiency, and we need this geographical spectrum efficiency to be properly incentivized by administrations. And geographical spectrum efficiency leads naturally from the individual link by link license to block licensing. We need to make sure E-band, consider that E-band can represent more than 70% of the links with the current distribution of off-bands. So we need to work and to be sure that E-band is released in full in all the countries, and with proper licensing in order to incentivize operators to move to this portion of the spectrum. And finally, we need, after the recommendations by CPT, to make sure that the W-band as you can see, 92 to 114 gigahertz, and the D-band 130 to 175 are released for the wireless backhaul. And next slide. And with this, I would like to thank you for the attention. And you can see here also the link to our websites where you can find publications that we are producing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renato. And we can now move straight on to Elizabeth Miguel, who's the Head of Government Affairs for Middle East and Africa for Qualcomm. Hello, Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin. And firstly, let me, on behalf of Qualcomm, thank CITC and ITUR for affording us an opportunity to participate in this session, looking at innovative ways of managing spectrum in order to foster adoption of emerging wireless technologies. It's an honor for me personally to be part of this diverse and distinguished panel. So at the very beginning, I just want to start by contextualizing my brief opening remarks, because as we all recognize, countries all over the world are at different developmental stages. And we also recognize that national ICT policies and objectives are tailored to address the unique national connectivity challenges of the countries. So like in many panels, we wear tinted glasses, and I'm also wearing a pair of tinted glasses. So the first tint that I'll be speaking from is from the perspective of Qualcomm as an inventor and a developer of technologies in connectivity, computing, and communication. And the second pair of glasses is really a geographic one. I want to focus my comments and my perspectives on the Middle East and Africa region. And as we all know, this is a large and diverse region. In it, we have countries that are as advanced, most advanced with ICT development, such as the country that is hosting this conference, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But also in this region, we have upward of 50 developing countries, and we have a share of least developed countries. Now, there are specific realities in this region. And one of them is that broadband penetration rates in many countries of this region are low. And broadband connectivity continues to be wireless. And even if I could be more specific, in sub-Saharan Africa, a mobile broadband remains the predominant access to the internet for citizens, both in urban and rural areas, even as we realize that there are great strides to expand availability of fiber networks. If I'm not mistaken, yesterday in one of the panels, there was a data point that even mentioned 90% of connectivity being through mobile broadband. So ladies and gentlemen, let's keep this in mind. It is in this environment that regulators are having to consider how best to foster efficient, innovative use of wireless spectrum to expand connectivity for individuals, businesses, and governments. So all the availability of technologies are at play, but while trying to understand the competing demands for spectrum, regulators are endeavoring to make spectrum available across different services, seeking to meet different evolving needs, and taking into account decisions made at international and regional level. So I want to put it to you that with that background and in this regard, IMT 2020 or 5G is perhaps one of the most notable technologies under consideration at this time. And particularly following the achievement of the two key milestones that are important for countries in our region, that is the decisions of WRC 19 for additional spectrum, and the recent completion of the IMT 2020 specification by Study Group 5. It's important for countries in our region because we look at the ITUR recommendations and the processes. So with that in mind, I'd like to offer a few perspectives given that background. So my first perspective is that knowing that IMT or 5G will use and leverage licensed, shared, and unlicensed spectrum in order to achieve the anticipated increases in connection speed, mobility, and capacity. To enable timely rollout and uptake of IMT 2020 5G in the region, given those realities I just talked about, we believe that individual licensing of the globally and regionally identified IMT spectrum in the low band, mid band, and high band should be prioritized. So that's the first perspective I'd like to give. Over and above that, as has been described by my previous speakers, of course, we will need to tap into spectrum sharing and unlicensed spectrum models. So without going into details, I think we can all agree that there is merit in shared spectrum access, and there's also merit in unlicensed spectrum for mobile broadband. Talking about unlicensed spectrum, as I see I have a minute or two left, I think as our first speaker did say, wireless access systems and radio LAN technology are key innovations with potential to deliver positive experiences from the most bandwidth intensive applications. And yes, the 6 gigahertz band has emerged, or part that has emerged as a key opportunity for unlicensed spectrum in various parts of the world. And that is what we are seeing. And the countries in the Middle East and Africa region are also looking at how best to deploy or how best to take advantage of the possibilities and opportunities here. Finally, I'd just like to say in my final statement is that spectrum licensing in all its forms should remain flexible to support the introduction of new applications in both new and existing assigned spectrum, including things like 5G NUR for broadcasting and CV2X. So as a final statement, I say that overall regulators should aim to make a wide variety of spectrum available under different licensing approaches that best fit the spectrum band in question. There is no one size that fits all. I believe that this is something that needs to be addressed at regional and at country level. At the end of the day, we're using spectrum and we're using technology to solve real life problems on the ground. So thank you very much for the opportunity to make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And we can move on now to get an operator's perspective from Hiroyuki Atarashi from NTT Docomo in Japan.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, for your kind introduction, and good day to everyone from Japan. First, I would like to thank CITC and ITU for inviting me to this workshop. As my opening remark in relation to the topic of this panel, I would like to introduce relevant activities in Japan. Please go to the next slide. This slide explains the spectrum allocation for 4G and 5G in Japan. As you can see the chart in below, the frequency bands 3400 to 4100 MHz and 4500 to 4600 MHz have been already assigned to mobile network operators for 4G or 5G. Different color codes indicate different mobile network operators. And within the frequency band 3400 to 4100 MHz, as you may know, this frequency band is usually used by the satellite networks. So in order to achieve coexistence between IMT base stations and the satellite network Earth stations, we have to conduct interference coordination between the mobile network operators and satellite networks operators in Japan. And please go to the next slide. This slide explains the situation of the millimeter wave 5G spectrum in Japan. We are using the so-called 28 gigahertz frequency band for the 5G networks of millimeter wave in Japan. And in this frequency band, again, we have to conduct interference coordination between mobile network operators and satellite network operators. And in this particular case, we have to protect satellite stations of the satellite network operators. So please go to the next slide. And currently, we are employing a new licensing scheme, so-called local 5G in Japan. And this licensing scheme enables various bodies and organizations, and this means other than MNOs, to deploy their 5G networks within their buildings and premises in accordance with individual, regional, and industrial needs. And in order to achieve this licensing scheme, Japanese government has been already allocated 100 MHz spectrum in 28 GHz frequency band in Japan. And in addition to that, Japanese government is going to assign additional spectrum for these local 5G schemes. And next slide, please. And this is my last slide. And in order to address growing demands for IoT and 5G, Japanese government is now investigating a dynamic frequency sharing mechanism in order to realize advanced frequency sharing with existing radio systems. And this concept is almost the same with the concept LSA employed in Europe. And in Japanese case, we are now investigating the 2.3 GHz frequency band. In this frequency band, broadcasters are using the spectrum for so-called electronics news gathering, but their usage may be limited in terms of the time and geography. And in order to use that spectrum on an occasional basis, as a secondary users, mobile network operators will try to use this spectrum. And in order to achieve advanced sharing mechanisms, we are going to develop frequency management systems to achieve this advanced sharing scheme. Japanese government is now trying to conclude this study by the next spring in next year. With that, I'd like to conclude my opening remarks. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Hiroyuki. Well, we're going to move now to questions for everybody. And if you have some questions, please feel free to put them in the chat there, and we'll come to them as soon as we can. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, and the first one I wanted to look at was from Dean Bubley, and it's a question for Alex, and he's asking, why hasn't the Wi-Fi Alliance and IEEE submitted Wi-Fi 6 as a candidate technology for IMT 2020 for indoor or local use?
Thank you for that question. I think I appreciate Dean and recognizing the fact that Wi-Fi 6E actually meets the IMT 2020 requirements. But let's keep in mind that IMT is an application in a mobile service developed on 3GPP technologies, not IEEE technologies, and used primarily by carriers. So perhaps it's a better suggestion for 5G NRU. But to step back to the question, I would answer it with another question. Why? Why would Wi-Fi go through that? I am old enough to remember when IMT concept was conceived at WRC 2000. With the objective of harmonizing cellular network use. And the reason was, so we have a cell phone, someone gets on a plane in the US and they fly to Europe or to Asia Pacific, they take the cell phone and how is it going to work? How do we harmonize this spectrum? I will not comment on how much IMT has achieved this objective, but I'm confident to say that Wi-Fi has achieved this international spectrum harmonization. When I travel, and hopefully I will again someday, when I check into the hotel or I go to a restaurant or any other venue, the first thing I ask for is, what is the Wi-Fi password? And all I need to do is to ask for SSID and password, and my device is guaranteed to work. It has never failed. And the reason that is because this international harmonization has been achieved, and our industry has developing that. So thanks again for that question.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. Did anybody else want to say anything? If you do, please raise your hand. I was going to move on to the next question which we had, which was primarily a question for Jennifer, which I'm sure other people could respond to if they wanted to. And it came from Rakesh Mehrotra, and he was talking about the raising of the noise floor, the sort of aggregation of more and more spectrum usage, which you were referring to. And he asked, is it necessary to have dynamic spectrum uses and authorization looking at interference? And how difficult is this with respect to the old ITUR radio regulations regime? So that sounds like a really good question.
I think I can write a thesis on this. So, Rakesh, thank you for the question. I think that's one of the questions. You know, it's interesting because before I came to the panel, I've been thinking about the multidimensional spectrum model for literally just the past couple of months. So I probably have more questions than I have answers right now. And so I'm going to give them some thought, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to have to, you know, if we're really going to take this view that spectrum is more than 2 or 3 dimensional, which is where I think we operate now, you know, time, geography, you know, and I think artificial intelligence, of course, is coming and is going to change things. I do think we're going to have to look at different factors, and I don't think aggregate is it. I think there's other things out there. You know, if you're getting interference from different places, I think the whole place changes. So I do think at some point, and, you know, I think it's off in the future that there probably will have to be a WRC that really takes a look at the changing use of spectrum and how that impacts the radio regulations. Some of it may never change. Some of it may be just fine, but there may be other pieces that do have to be addressed. So I think it's a great question, Rakesh. And I'm sorry, I don't have a better or more complete answer for you.
Hopefully we'll all have retired by the time the WRC addresses that very difficult question.
Well, after Alex made me sound so old, saying 2000 was years ago, but
we had a question for Renato, which is a very interesting exploration of the issue of some people already having a license for backhaul. How do you, in the millimeter waves, how do you incorporate that with an approach to 5G? And this comes from Azim Fard from Iran. And he says, you know that the big portion of IMT millimeter wave bands have been used by microwave links. Yeah. I appreciate if you share thoughts on the use of these bands by both backhaul and access. One option we think in Iran is to license these blocks of frequencies for 5G access for those operators having microwave links in the same band, especially in 26 gigahertz band. What's your view on that, Renato?
Thank you for the question. Actually, it's not a very big portion because 26 gigahertz is definitely important, but in terms of percentage of links deployed in the world is just a few percentage. It's important in some countries, this is true. We have run a lot of simulations in terms of coexistence. Frankly speaking, they cannot coexist easily. So this is a sort of, if the 26 gigahertz in country by country is released for IMT, they should foresee sooner or later a migration plan or a replanning of those links into other frequency bands. For sure, there are options. 32 gigahertz, E-band can well cover the applications of the 26. For some countries, it will take longer because of the number of links deployed in the 26. For others, will be much easier and faster. Overall, let me say, as representing microwave industry, we say more access, more backhaul. So that's our business. So if there are no base stations to backhaul, there's no backhaul at all. So at the end, we need to live with the fact that access will need more licensed spectrum. We also need licensed spectrum because of the guarantee of the quality of service we have to provide for the backhaul to operators. And so coexistence is quite difficult.
Thank you, Renato. There's a question from Andy Clegg of Google to Hiroyuki from NTT Docomo. And Andy is asking, if I read your spectrum plot correctly, Japan assigned 4,000 to 4,100 megahertz for 4G. Has Japan had any issues with interference to radio altimeters in 4,200 to 4,400 megahertz caused by 4G operating in 4,000 to 4,100? So do you have any insight on that, Hiroyuki?
Yeah, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Andy, for these questions. Yes, actually, in Japan, we carefully studied this interference matters with respect to the potential interference to the radio altimeters. And based on the technical studies, we decided to allocate 100 megahertz guard band between 5G and radio altimeters. And we also developed some deployment restriction close to the airport and the heliport. And although the deployment of the 5G or 5G base station is still limited, I have never heard the interference issues between 5G and radio altimeters. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question here for you, which was who would run the database systems for the frequency coordination in LSA? And that's an interesting point. Sorry, I'm calling it their LSA. You referred to it as dynamic spectrum access, but the 2.3 gigahertz system you were talking about. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I think no official decision has been made yet, but according to my assumption, that database will be run by third party and neutral party to achieve coexistence between different systems.
I had a question myself, which was, how interested are you as an operator in this dynamic sharing in 2.3 gigahertz? Do you regard it as being something that's second best and you would really much prefer exclusive spectrum, or is it more attractive to you than that?
Yeah, this kind of spectrum should be used as for complementary use. And because we have some restriction in the time and geography on that use of the spectrum. So we are considering to use this kind of spectrum for special cases. For example, if we have some event, people get there are a lot of people. In that case, we can use such a spectrum temporarily, and it would help to alleviate the congestions of our network. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Well, one thing I noticed from listening to both Jennifer talking and also Renato talking is that Renato was talking about block licensing being something that spurs innovation more than link by link licensing. And Jennifer was talking about blanket licensing being better than licensing for individual. I think you were referring to country by country licensing. I think. I wonder if you could both talk about that a bit, and Renato, particularly if you could start by explaining why you think this block licensing is more likely to spur innovation.
Yeah, because if you think of block licensing and the operator has the responsibility to manage the radio resource, so it can accept, for instance, a different type of KPI instead of on a link-by-link basis. So it means that frequency cancellation, frequency mitigation, all techniques that could lead to the frequency reuse, and so a much better management of the radio resource on an area basis. This naturally leads to block licensing. Link by link means that the coordination of the links is under responsibility of the country administration. And this, in our view, is not the best if we want to exploit interference cancellation, interference mitigations, overall radio resource management. Then the last link by link means that the operator should apply on a link basis. So it's also quite long process procedure, while within a certain block of license, they have the full responsibility how to use this radio resource.
Jennifer, is there a parallel with your approach to blanket licensing?
Yes, but also we're also a terrestrial license in Europe with CGC, and and we have a dedicated block of spectrum, 15 by 15, I guess actually, yeah. 15 by 15 megahertz block of spectrum in Europe, and for terrestrial and satellite. And many of the countries have this link by link, which is ridiculous because we have the spectrum, but yet we still have to go in and get each link approved and register the base stations. It's very similar to the blanket licensing. The blanket licensing, and I'll give an example, Brazil, for instance, which we're watching an evolution, which is great, had a requirement where you had to go in, and if I installed a VSAT at Renato's home, I'd have to give the location and register. And once, it slows it down, it makes it extremely onerous. So these sorts of, what I'd say, antiquated licensing processes, because there's really no reason that the regulator needs to know just where these are, especially, where you've got the access to the spectrum, I think are one of the things that are really important to change, both terrestrially and on the space side. And I totally forgot about the terrestrial side, but I think that's analogous.
Thank you. I wonder if we could have a final word from the panel. And what I'd like you to think about is whether you see these sorts of new licensing approaches that we've been discussing as a threat or an opportunity, because I think if you're an incumbent in a particular band, it would be perfectly reasonable to see this as a threat to what you're trying to do. But then again, you might also see sort of opportunities in it as well. So if we could go in the order that everyone spoke, and I could go to Alex first.
Oh, thanks, Martin. And I think that's a very good point to close our discussion on. So I think the benefits and opportunities are for the public interest, for the regulators, to extract the maximum value, the maximum utilization of spectrum. Again, spectrum, limited natural resource, it's a national resource for the benefit of the country. How do you extract the most of it? Only with new licensing approaches or unlicensed use, or figuring out that, for example, operations indoor can protect operations outdoor, or some other regulatory solutions. There's ways to make the spectrum much more efficient and much more valuable for the society as a whole. And that's what I think we should focus on. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer.
Sure, thank you. So as an incumbent, I don't love it, but I think it is an opportunity at the end of the day. And that's why I put slide 3 in my slide deck of things that the regulators have to take account of. If it is things like understanding that you do need long-term certainty, so you can't just come in and one day Alex's regulator can't, because he used to be my regulator at the FCC, can't come in and say, you know what, Jennifer, we need that spectrum, we're going to do this. Technology neutrality, understanding that there's more than one technology. Harmonization, there's a number of factors. So I think if it's done in the right way, it's something that's an opportunity for everyone. And, having some disruption isn't a bad thing, but I think that you have to think about the impact on investment, the impact on the existing users, the impacts on bringing in and continuing services, but also allowing services to evolve. I think one of the questions is, do you stay with the same technology or do you evolve? One of the things that's really important is that in the regulatory regimes, regulators need to give that flexibility to the operator so that we can adjust to new technologies as they come along and become more efficient ourselves as incumbent operators. So thank you.
Thank you. Renato.
No, definitely as an opportunity, at least what we are doing, in the sense that in our work in the industry group of this industry group of ETSI, there are several big important operators represented, both incumbent and not. So definitely this is an opportunity to improve spectrum efficiency. And I think this should also be the final goal of every administration. So at the end, we have to be able to backhaul large amount of capacities for the 5G and what is coming next. So definitely we need new regulations, new licensing schemes for managing the spectrum. Second, but let me say not secondary importance, when I speak of licensing, it also terms of licensing costs, because nowadays the licensing costs for spectrum are becoming one of the major items in the TCO of operators. So definitely they cannot make the cost of licensing grow linearly with the increase of capacity. So we need somehow to bend the curve.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, if we could move to you, and of course you have a particular responsibility for Africa and the Middle East, so it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about how helpful sort of innovative approaches to licenses could be in that region.
Yes, absolutely, opportunities to be leveraged, but absolutely true also is that individual licensing remains a priority because connectivity needs to take place. IMT 2020, we are in 2020. To move the needle, to get the connectivity going, the individual licensing is prioritized. But we can see that using shared and unlicensed spectrum and all these new regimes can be leveraged in the region as well.
Thank you very much. Hiroyuki, if we could give you the last word from the panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, exclusive license is easier to deploy mobile networks. But in order to increase the opportunity and spectrum efficiency as a whole, I believe it would be beneficial to consider new licensing.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much to the panelists, and thank you for all your questions. And I take away from this 2 pieces of reading matter, one of which is Jennifer's response to the Loon filing on the, which I assume is on the FCC website, is it? I guess so. And also Renato's paper on backhaul in millimeter wave. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to all of our panelists there. So thank you all very much. Another fascinating discussion. So really do appreciate that. So thank you. So our next speaker, next we're going to have another thinking point. Unfortunately, John is just slightly delayed. So we're just going to have a couple of minutes whilst we try and get him onto the platform. So we'll hope to be back literally within about 2 or 3 minutes. So please do stay where you are. And we're just going to try and get John onto the platform. And we'll be back here, as I said, in about 2 or 3 minutes for our next part of the program, which is our thinking point from John Peha. So we'll be back here very, very shortly. Thank you. So thank you, everybody. We're back, and we're delighted to now have John Peha with us. So, Professor, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Great to have you with us, and thank you so much for joining us. So we're really looking forward to now to hearing your thinking point. So understand that you're going to be discussing vehicle communication and specifically the potential efficiencies that could be derived from allowing V2X communication to share spectrum with unlicensed devices, as well as obviously through licensed and mobile devices. So we're really looking forward to hearing that. And I've also had a special request from one of our hosts, from Mohammed Al-Ataibi, who wanted me to extend a particular welcome to yourself, because I understand he was one of your former students, and he's mentioned that and asked me just to extend a very warm welcome to you from him personally as well. So that said, John, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you, and we'll bring your slides up when you get started.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks, Mohammed. You can put the slides up anytime. I'm John Peha, as you said, from Carnegie Mellon University in the United States, talking about spectrum sharing with intelligent transportation systems. Slide 2, please. So what am I talking about? Intelligent transportation systems support vehicular communications, that is, communications from vehicle to vehicle, from vehicle to nearby roadside infrastructure, V2I, from vehicle to all sorts of things, pedestrian, cyclist, whatever, which collectively we call V2X, and I'm going to be using that acronym throughout this talk. This does not require costly cell towers. It does not require service from cellular operators, although those might be used as a supplement if they are available. Now, the ITU recommended that administrations consider using 5850 to 5925 megahertz or parts thereof so we can have global harmonization for ITS. Next slide, please. So why would we want this thing? Safety has been an important reason from the beginning. For example, we've been playing with an application called forward collision warning, where when two cars are traveling down a highway, if the rear car is coming too close to the one in front and there's a risk of collision, the rear car driver can get a warning, even when they can't see each other, even when one car is around the turn. There's left turn warning. You want to turn left at an intersection and there's incoming traffic you can't see. You could get a warning light that there's risk of collision. Or for vehicle to infrastructure, perhaps you get a warning that you are approaching an icy road. Now, the US Department of Transportation a couple of years ago estimated that just a few of these applications could prevent roughly 10% of vehicle crashes in the country. So safety applications are one set of applications. There's also traffic management and smart signal lights. In this case, I mean vehicular traffic. Vehicles and signal lights can communicate and coordinate to manage the flow of traffic better, to reduce commute times, to reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce fuel consumption. There's infotainment. Perhaps I'll download a new map of a neighborhood I'm in or stream video to my son in the back seat. And eventually this may be important for autonomous vehicles of various kinds, perhaps for platooning, where you have a series of cars going down the highway where only the lead car has a human driver. And by communication among the cars, we can make it safer and more efficient. Next slide, please. Many countries have now established ITS spectrum bands that is available for V2X on an exclusive basis, using either DSRC technology or CV2X technology. But this is mid-band spectrum. This is valuable spectrum for many other purposes, including cellular. There's a lot of demand for it, so we really don't want to waste it. And the point of this talk is that one way we might use it more efficiently is to share some of it. You can do that either by allowing V2X into other bands besides the ITS band, or we can allow other kinds of devices, in particular unlicensed devices, into the ITS band. Either way, you get sharing. Next slide, please. So here is the model. This is some research we've done where we said, all right, I'm going to divide V2X traffic into two categories. There is the safety critical and latency sensitive traffic. Safety critical meaning, this could have loss of life or property damage, and latency sensitive meaning it matters how soon those packets are received. So for crash avoidance is clearly both of those things. But there's also traffic that is either non-safety critical, it's downloading a map, or it's just not latency sensitive. It doesn't matter if it takes a second. And I'm going to divide those things into different parts of the spectrum. Let the latency sensitive safety critical traffic get its own spectrum, but let's let the non-safety critical traffic share with unlicensed devices and see what happens. In particular, it's going to be Wi-Fi in this talk. Next slide, please. So we considered a wide range of scenarios. I can only show you one or two here. We looked at, for unlicensed devices, we looked at Wi-Fi hotspots, both indoor Wi-Fi and outdoor Wi-Fi, that is sort of municipal Wi-Fi. Let's cover the city. We'll assume that the indoor Wi-Fi is busy about 15% of the time in the busy hour. Outdoor is busy all the time. We'll play with the data rates. We will assume TCP/IP. I'm going to make the important assumption that there's no Wi-Fi inside the car itself. It's either in homes and businesses, indoors, or it's outdoors, but fixed. We also have, make lots of assumptions about the vehicular network. I will vary, for example, the number of cars that have V2X technology. I will assume DSRC technology, which being in the United States was the standard for a number of years, although that may change in 2021. And we'll play with data rates and other things. Next slide, please. And here are some actual results. So we want to know what happens when you share spectrum to both vehicular throughput and Wi-Fi throughput. Now the y-axis here is the is the Wi-Fi throughput, and the x-axis is how much spectrum we're talking about. And we consider two scenarios with different in a number of ways, but perhaps the most important way it turns out is whether you have outdoor Wi-Fi as well as indoor or just indoor. Now, the bottom two curves there, one of them shows the throughput you can achieve for Wi-Fi if Wi-Fi gets all the band to itself. And the other one is the throughput you get for Wi-Fi if you share. And they're essentially on top of each other, which means Wi-Fi is not affected at all in this scenario. The upper two curves are the same thing, except a different scenario. And here you can see that there's a difference. And Wi-Fi may take a 10% hit if you have, if it's outdoor Wi-Fi is involved. Next slide, please. So that's the Wi-Fi side of things. What about the vehicular throughput, the vehicular to V2X traffic side of things? This is the same graph, except now the y-axis is the V2X throughput. And same two scenarios. Bottom scenarios, again, those curves are on top of each other, which means basically whether you share or you don't, you get the same V2X throughput. The upper one, the V2X throughput, is more significantly degraded by sharing. But still, you got Wi-Fi throughput too. That's not a bad deal, maybe. Next slide, please. To really find out if it's a good idea, what we do is we say, how much spectrum would you need to achieve the throughputs for both of these things that we talked about? In this graph, the x-axis is the throughput for V2X. The color actually represents the throughput for Wi-Fi, so I can get 3 dimensions here. And the y-axis of this graph is how much spectrum you need. The top curve shows how much spectrum you need to achieve those throughputs if there's a one band exclusively for Wi-Fi and one band exclusively for V2X. The lower curve shows how much if you share, and you see it is a lot less. So it is much more efficient in this particular scenario, and it turns out in lots of scenarios we looked at to have sharing in terms of achieving given throughputs than to have exclusive access. Next slide, please. So that's a simple kind of coexistence sharing. There's actually multiple ways you can share in general, which is a long conversation. We can have sharing based on coexistence. I put up with your interference and you put up with mine. Or we can actually have cooperation, which will sometimes give you better efficiency. Our devices work together and coordinate in some way. And in this particular case, we saw 2 ways you might coordinate. One is what we call backhaul cooperation. It would work kind of like this. If you want to put your Wi-Fi hotspots in my ITS band, here is what you have to do. You have to be able, your devices have to be able to receive V2X packets and send them out on your own backhaul. Or we have relay cooperation. You still have to receive V2X packets on your Wi-Fi, but now instead of sending it on your backhaul, you just relay those packets to another V2X device if there's one nearby. And we tried out both of those. Next slide, please. And here is the same kind of graph I showed you before. Again, x-axis is the throughput you can achieve, you're trying to achieve. Y-axis is how much spectrum you need. That top curve, once again, is exclusive access, 1 block for V2X, 1 block for Wi-Fi. The bottom curve, or excuse me, the middle curve is actually 2 curves. You can't see them, they're right on top of each other. Relay cooperation and coexistence are right on top of each other. And then slightly below that is backhaul cooperation. So backhaul cooperation is best, but not by very much. Next slide. So, all right, I won't make you endure any more graphs. What did we learn from all of this? We learned that co-equal sharing of spectrum is an effective way for non-safety critical DSRC communications. Right? There's a little degradation in on the V2X traffic, especially if you have outdoor Wi-Fi, but the benefits of sharing more than make up for this. This turns out to be a more efficient way of achieving given throughput. Next slide, please. So that's what we learn about whether we should share at all. What do we learn about what type of sharing? We considered 3 kinds of co-equal sharing: coexistence, backhaul and relay cooperation. Coexistence is as effective as relay cooperation and almost effective as backhaul cooperation. Coexistence is usually what spectrum regulators do. It is less complex. The systems are not intertwined, so it is easy to change one without affecting the other. So given that it's almost as good, that is the kind of sharing that we think works best. And next slide. So finally, recommendations and limitations based on everything I've seen, everything I've described. We should seriously consider allowing unlicensed devices into ITS bands and allowing V2X into unlicensed bands. Something that at least in countries I am well familiar with, we're not currently considering. We're focused only on exclusive use. And it seems to be very efficient, and we should do so using coexistence-based sharing schemes. But some limitations on what I just said that are important. First of all, I am only talking about traffic that is not safety critical and latency sensitive. This is not what you would do with the V2X traffic crash avoidance. A second thing is that we should, I excluded Wi-Fi from being inside the car. And we may need to make sure that while Wi-Fi might be in the car, or might be in the spectrum band, not Wi-Fi devices that are actually in the car traveling with the V2X device. And the third limitation, of course, is I presented results with DSRC, which made sense not very long ago. As there is more emphasis on CV2X, we would like to see if the results are the same with CV2X, and we haven't seen that yet. And of course, that will be important before regulators make real decisions. But we need to start considering these things. And thank you. That's my talk. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. Thank you. That was a fascinating insight into, the future of transport, the future connected vehicles, I suppose. So we do have a couple of questions coming in. So first of all, we have a question from Zayed Aldobayan, and apologies if my pronunciation wasn't spot on there. So Zayed asks, what are the challenges that are facing the ITS and preventing it from being adopted globally? And asks whether you feel it could be because of the lack of harmonization.
There are certainly a number of challenges, and one of the big challenges, even within a country, is that there's little incentive to go first. Right? I don't want to be the only one in my town to own a telephone because there's no one to call. I don't want to be the only one in the town with a car that does V2V because there's no vehicle to talk to or infrastructure to connect with, and nobody wants to build infrastructure when there are no vehicles. This makes it really hard to get started, even within a city or within a country, and that can global harmonization can only compound that. In that, will a car company deploy when it can only deploy that equipment in one country, and every country is different. So I don't see harmonization as the biggest challenge to get started, but it could help.
Perfect. No, that sounds great. Yeah, good answer. So no, that sounds good. Understood on that. And maybe one other question. I suppose talking about the amount of spectrum that the regulators should maybe allocate to ITS. So with regards to the kind of things that you were talking about and the type of spectrum sharing that you were talking about, I mean, how would that affect maybe the amount of spectrum that you feel regulators should be allocating for intelligent transportation systems?
I think allowing sharing should allow us to reduce the amount of spectrum that is allocated for V2X on an exclusive basis, which may be particularly important. In the United States, just decided to reduce its allocation from 75 to 30. How do you live within 30? We may be able to do that by sharing outside the 30. It may actually increase the amount of spectrum that V2X can use if you include both the shared and the exclusive. And this also will improve efficiency because the shared is used very efficiently.
Yeah. John, thank you so much. And I don't know, it is quite early. I think it's quite early there for you. So I really do appreciate you getting up early to join us and your time for making that fascinating presentation. So thank you once again on behalf of everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next we have a very short break. We're running slightly behind schedule, so we're going to cut the break down to about 5 minutes if we can. So we're going to be back in around about 5 minutes or so. So around about past. We'll be back with our next session. So the next session is going to be looking at facilitating wireless access and investments for a smarter future. So that's going to be back here on main stage in just about 5 minutes or so. But for now, thank you again to John for that fascinating insight into spectrum and connectivity for ITS and for V2X communications. Thank you to Martin Sims and to the panelists in our previous session. And of course, thank you to our opening keynote presentation, Mr. Sunil Bharti Mittal, as well for his keynote too. So thank you to all of those. And as I said, we'll be back here in just around about 5 minutes. Thanks very much.